Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Good evening and welcome to Purdue Asian American and Asian Resource and Cultural Center Speaker Series. My name is Pam Sari and I direct the ARC here at Purdue University. And Purdue ARC, as you know, is one of the cultural centers at Purdue University under the Division of Diversity and Inclusion. Thank you again for taking the time out of your busy evening to be with us at this moment. If this is the first time that you are introduced to our center or our event, we would love to hear further from you. There are several ways that you can do that. The first one is to follow Purdue ARC on our social media accounts. We are at Purdue AAARCC on Instagram and Facebook, Twitter, and also on YouTube. The second one, you can subscribe to our newsletter. If you go to Purdue ARC website, you can opt to receive a weekly electronic newsletter from us. And the third one, if you're able right now in this time, you can still visit our center. We're open Mondays to Fridays, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. You can utilize our resources, also attend our next events, and definitely recommend our center to other people. So the ARC Speaker Series program engages the diversity of Asian and Asian American communities through inviting scholars, practitioners, artists, creative communities, and others who are doing inspirational work to meet with our Purdue communities. And we're delighted tonight to welcome back Dr. Lisa Hanasono to our campus. And I said earlier how I wish that we could welcome you in person, Dr. Hanasono. Our schedule tonight is as follows. Dr. Hanasono will speak for about an hour or so, and then all of you will be given an opportunity to ask questions for about 45-50 minutes. And at the end of the event, we will ask that you provide the event evaluation form. It is in your email, but we also would like to drop it on the chat as well so that it's easier for you. Your feedback is important to our future programming, as we all know, so please take a couple minutes to do so. During the Q&A to ask questions, you can use the chat feature to ask your questions, and I would be monitoring the chat. There are a couple of us who will do so. If you do not want to forget your questions, you can drop it on the chat at any time, and we will go through them during the Q&A time. If you would like to ask your questions anonymously, you can send it via chat to me. My name is Pam Sari on the chat. So Dr. Hanasono also requested that she's able to see all of us and not just speaking to a blank wall. So again, when it's possible, you can turn on your videos throughout her presentation. We just ask that you mute your audio. And also our event tonight will be recorded and live captioning is provided. If you would like to use the closed captioning, please remember to turn on the feature by either clicking on the closed captioning button or 3 dots on your screen and turn the feature there. So on behalf of Purdue ARC, I would like to thank Dr. Lisa Hanasono tonight. I would like to also thank Purdue ARC staff for the work done for this event, and thank you, Terry Wood, for providing our live captioning tonight. So Dr. Lisa Hanasono is an associate professor at the School of Media and Communication at Bowling Green State University. She will be presenting tonight on innovative pedagogies and community interventions to reduce prejudice, stigma, and discrimination. Dr. Hanasono completed her PhD in communication from Purdue University and was actively involved with the founding of the ARC. So back then, Dr. Hanasono actually was one of the first few people who taught classes about Asian American experiences, and perhaps she will mention about that as well. She, and I remember Dr. Kate Agathon and other people were actively reaching out and bridging the faculty and students, staff at Purdue, and even Asian American communities from other universities near us. So thank you so much, Dr. Hanasono, for that. Dr. Hanasono's research has been published in the Journal of International and Intercultural Communication, Communication Quarterly, Communication Teacher, and Human Communication Research. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Lisa Hanasono.
Thank you so much for the great introduction. Hello and welcome. And thank you all so much for deciding to be here on a Thursday afternoon or evening, depending on your time zone. My name is Lisa Hanasono. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And before I get started, I do want to just personally thank Pam and Manabu and Kathleen and Terry, ARC and Purdue for making this whole event possible. So much happens behind the scenes. As I was telling Pam earlier, I do a lot of planning on my campus, and I know there's a lot of work that goes on. So just from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for inviting me back. In many ways, this feels like a virtual homecoming, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But whether we are convening through Zoom or we're convening in person, getting a chance to be reconnected with the Purdue community is always a joy, something I look forward to and something I cherish so much. So it's great to be back in this kind of virtual space with you. It's great to be connected. And it's also wonderful to see some familiar names and faces who are in this space with us today. So it's nice to connect with some folks who I haven't talked with in years, so it's so nice. So before we get started, before I jump into some topics that are near and dear to me, we're going to be talking about innovative pedagogies and community interventions in an effort that try to reduce stigma, stop prejudice and discrimination. I'd like to go ahead and just kind of warm us up and to invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat. So if you feel comfortable, I welcome you to go ahead and drop your name. If you'd like to share your gender pronouns, feel free to do so. And if you'd also like to share your geographical location and maybe what you hope to get out of this session. So essentially, I want you to introduce yourselves. Some of you may know each other very well, but it's quite possible that this could be a way to build your network. You might connect with someone here that you might not have necessarily met originally. And so I think that's one of the beautiful things about ARC is that they do build community, and this can be an opportunity for you to meet some new people, to build connections. And especially now in a time of social isolation and a time of social distancing, I think it's perhaps more important than ever to be connecting, to feel connected. And so that can start with just a simple hello. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, feel free to do so. And we'll be using the chat kind of throughout today just to kind of keep us all engaged and keep us all connected. Okay, so your name, geographical location, and what you hope to get out of this session. Let me go ahead and introduce myself while you are starting to introduce yourself in the chat. This is a photo of me when I was a little girl, and I often think about our origin stories. You know, if you think about your childhood, if you think about how that informs who you are today, what you do, what you're interested in, what your passions are. This is a moment where it got started for me. I grew up in the Midwest, and as an Asian American girl, I was often asked this very common question, a question that's often asked of people of Asian descent, which is the classic, where are you from? And as a kid growing up, when people asked me that, my go-to response tended to be, quite proudly initially, was that I'm from Indiana, that I was born and raised in Indiana. And for many times, that was kind of enough. That was kind of the icebreaker, and we moved on with our conversation, and that was pretty exciting. But for many people, it kind of was confusing, especially in the decade in which I was a child growing up. Sometimes people's heads would turn a little bit, and they'd look kind of perplexed. And they would ask a follow-up question. And over time, I got to know this script very well. So the follow-up question was, no. Where are your parents from? And I would smile and I would politely say, my parents, they're from Southern California. In fact, they went to UCLA and they met there, fell in love, yada, yada, yada. They found jobs in Indiana, and my brother and I were born. So, you know, sometimes that suffices, and we'll talk about UCLA or we'll talk about other things, maybe the Colts, maybe the Boilermakers, but typically it just ends up begging more questions, and the person looks more confused and they say, no, where were your grandparents from, right? And at this point, I kind of know where we're going, and I will say, oh, my grandparents are from they're from the Bay Area of California. And at this point, my conversational partner is usually really not satisfied at all. So I kind of get to the point where I know what they're trying to get to, but I explain that I am a fourth generation Japanese American woman. I am Yonsei, is one way to call it. And so that's how I self-identify, who was born and raised in the Midwest, specifically in the Indianapolis area. So this is me kind of growing up, and it was a very kind of strange space. On the one hand, I performed a lot of Hoosier identity. You know, I took dance classes, I did show choir, I graduated from a public Indiana high school, and all of this informs who I am. But in many ways, I also was marked as racially other, Right. So growing up, I experienced taunts on the playground. I was called racial slurs. I had a friend who once confided in me that she didn't want me to touch her dolls because she thought I would get them dirty, which is not good. And a bunch of different things kind of happened as I got into high school. People would make kind of racial jokes, all of these things that just continued to make me realize that no matter what I did, no matter what clothes I wore, no matter how I fashioned my hair, no matter what words I chose to utter, that no matter what, there were some moments where I was going to be otherized. And that became something that as a kid, I kept quiet. I was ashamed. I just wanted to blend in. I didn't want to be different. And I tried as hard as I could just to keep my head down and keep quiet. And it really wasn't until I got to college that I started to question this and to push back and to think more critically. And it wasn't really until I got to grad school that I started to explore this and connect it to notions of activism, notions of social change, and social justice. And so it was really quite a journey. But I will say my roots are from Indiana, which is near and dear to my heart. So after earning my master's in Ohio, I came back to Indiana, and this time I decided to pursue my PhD in communication studies at Purdue. And I am so grateful for this. This was a life-changing event for me. Purdue always has had a really strong communication studies program. And so when I got accepted, I think it was the same day, I just said, I'm in, I'm going to Purdue. I want to earn my PhD at Purdue. They have one of the top interpersonal communication programs in the nation. Let's do it. And I have never regretted that decision. But one thing that was really amazing was, even though I came in the communication program, and that's where I ultimately earned my PhD, I became part of a much bigger community, something much bigger than myself. It was no longer just about who am I and where am I from, but it started to become who are we and where are we going together? And I think that was something that was born at Purdue for me experientially, that was life altering and incredibly gratifying. So I got involved in the Council on Asian American Studies, which Pam mentioned, kind of fortuitously. So I am a caffeine addict. And I, as a graduate student, was drinking a lot of coffee and working really hard. And I just happened to be heading to the HTML Cafe. And I don't even know if that still exists on campus. I apologize. But I was heading from Beering Hall over to a little place to get some coffee. And I happened to run into a friend from grad school named Chris. And he said, "Hey, are you going to the meeting?" And I had no idea which meeting, whatever. So I kind of asked, which meeting? He said, there is a group of faculty and staff and students and leaders who are coming together, and they're going to start an Asian American Studies program. You should show up. And it just happened to be, we just happened to cross paths at that particular moment. I happened to get the invite, and I happened to say, that sounds like a really good idea. And so I ended up showing up, and it was just mind-blowing in terms of the passion, the expertise, and the synergies that were happening. I wanted to be part of this. And so I started to volunteer more and more, get involved in leadership opportunities, and together, faculty, grad students, undergrads, as well as administrators and staff, we all kind of came together and we proposed the curriculum and the structure for an Asian American Studies program and minor. And lo and behold, it actually took root, it passed, which is so exciting. And so it was really a great honor to be part of that. And I'm so thrilled, when I come back and check out the web presence and see all the programming that's being done, to see how strong Purdue's program is, how strong things are going at Purdue. I'm just so proud of y'all. It's amazing. So we certainly had a lot of help from the Big Ten, CISM Consortium. We did get our Asian American Studies program and minor set up. I got an opportunity to teach the Intro to Asian American Studies course during this earlier iteration. But I do want to note that one dream that was not fulfilled during my time at Purdue, regrettably, was the establishment of a cultural center. That was something that we had dreamt of, something that we knew it was absolutely imperative at Purdue, especially, but very, very much imperative. And we worked, we planned, we got groups of people together, but unfortunately weren't able to get it done during my time at Purdue. So I graduated and I jumped on the tenure track. And after I left, lo and behold, some magic happened. And I'm just so grateful that this is where we are today. I'm just so thrilled about the center and the amazing programming and everything that's happening, how ARC is bringing people together in meaningful ways, even when we aren't physically doing that, right? But we did a lot of programming while I was there. We even co-hosted an Asian American Studies graduate program, conference actually with IU Bloomington, which was pretty cool. So there's a lot of really fun things that happen. And what I'm basically trying to say is that Purdue is near and dear to my heart, that being part of this program was life-changing for me, and I'm so grateful to be back here with you, and I'm hoping to make some connections with some of the expertise that I've cultivated since leaving Purdue to share with you as it relates to focusing on stopping discrimination, stopping prejudice, and making a difference. This is wonderful. So as an overview for what we're going to talk about, we are going to talk about three main things. So first, I want to make sure that we are explicit about this current moment that we're in. And I want to take a moment just to recognize our reality and to note that it is not some anomaly, that rather it's connected to a longer pattern and deeper history. So I want us to kind of just take note of this moment in this context. As a communication scholar, we know that context matters. So we're going to talk about that briefly. And then we're going to move on to talk about communicating change. So what are some things that we might do as educators? What are some things that we might do individually in our classes and in our communities to make an impact, to destigmatize, to stop discrimination, and to reduce prejudice? And so I'm going to share some ideas. The idea is to really just kind of whet your appetite and to spark some ideas. So I want to encourage you to kind of take some of the things that I talk about, especially in the second part of my presentation, and think about how you can personalize it, how you can take it and run with it. So there are going to be some moments at the end for Q&A, but as Pam said, if you do have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'm happy to either pause or we can kind of address them at the end. So with that said, I've got just a couple of guidelines, final thing before we jump into today, which is talking about technological considerations. So if you want to share your video, it's so nice to see your faces. I'm teaching on Zoom this semester, and I'm used to teaching into kind of an abyss of a bunch of just kind of boxes with people's names on it. And I totally get it. If you do not want to share your video, then please don't feel compelled to. But if you want to volunteer your face and connect in that regard, I certainly welcome your smiling faces or your not smiling faces, either way. We've talked about the closed captioning, so thank you so much for making that happen. And let's see, in terms of if you want to, you can actually click on the three dots that are up in the right-hand corner of on your name, and you can rename yourself to include your gender pronouns if you would like. I never want to misgender someone, but certainly just to kind of let you know that that is an option to you if you'd like to also include your gender pronouns with your name. We are going to have moments where I'm going to ask you to participate. I'm going to ask you to use the chat, ask you to use different reactions. So feel free to use the technology. I think that's one of the nice things about Zoom, is that there are more ways to interact. And then I just wanted to add three more things. So first of all, if you have a question for me, one thing that you can do if you wanted to add it in the chat, because sometimes there will be a lot of things that happen in the chat. If you have something that you want to raise specifically as a question pertaining to today's content, you can either send it to Pam, you can post it broadly, but if you put this Q with the colons on it, it kind of visually flags to me that, hey, this is a question, and it helps me pull that out from the sea of comments and things that might be happening today. Okay, here we go. I also do want to mention a trigger warning. Simply, as you know from the title, today is going to be about talking about stigma, discrimination, prejudice. So there are going to be some heavy topics and things where we will talk about real world issues, things that are happening right now. So I do want to just mention that and to share that. If you do need to take a pause, exit, or mute me for whatever reason, feel free to do so. But I do want to just give you a heads up. And I also do want to pause to ask, I like to think of this as a co-created space. And so are there any additional guidelines, rules, or recommendations that you would like us to abide by today? I'm going to pause myself if you want to unmute or if you want to drop it in the chat. Okay. Well, if something does come to you, feel free to put it in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and share. Your voice is important, your thoughts are important, and I want you to really get a lot out of today's session. So let's go ahead and begin. I want to first start out, like I mentioned, with just taking a moment to recognize our reality. The year is 2020. There have been a lot of memes about this very, very, very intense year, but I do think that it's important, all memes aside, to just kind of recognize where we are at this moment, not to stress you out, but rather just to recognize, to affirm, to not gaslight, and to just really be aware of what's happening. So we know with the pandemic that there are a lot of uncertainties, there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of of things that are happening in our universities. We've got the pivot to online. Some folks are teaching hybrid. Some folks are on campus. Some folks are at home. And we know that the pandemic has led to a lot of precarity in terms of our jobs, precarity in terms of our own well-being, our health, our relationships with loved ones. This is a really, really, really difficult period of time. And even though we have ways to engage in self-care to support each other, I just want to recognize that this is a really important external reality that's very much integrated into our day-to-day lives. You know, we're all dealing with the pandemic together, but we are also fighting for racial justice and social justice. I hope many of you are part of that effort together. And so it's not just recognizing that there are enormous health problems, public health problems, there's enormous crises that are happening economically, but we know that there is a pressing, urgent crisis as it relates to racial justice, racial injustice, and the need for more social justice. And of course, as we know with last night's debate, that there certainly is a very contested election that's happening right now. So we are living in a hypercharged time, a time of unprecedented stress, and in many ways, it's exacerbating inequities. It is exacerbating tensions. And because of all of this, we will note, I think in many ways, that aspects of discrimination, aspects of prejudice, in many ways are bubbling over. This is something that's just like a perfect storm in terms of this being an issue. So I think this presentation today is really timely, but I do want to just mention that aspects of racism, and given today's focus with partnering with AAARCC, you know, aspects of anti-Asian racism specifically, is not just an amazing thing that started in 2020. We're seeing kind of a critical watershed moment. We are seeing some really big things happen this year, but it's not like there weren't things bubbling under the surface, and it's not as if there weren't decades, if not hundreds of years of discrimination. So I just wanted to note this, right? Because I think sometimes people think, oh my goodness, there's anti-Asian sentiment. Where did that come from? But I think many of us know that this is something that's been going on for a long period of time. So in an effort to keep things really short, you know, I just want to, you know, acknowledge that there's been many, many challenges as it relates to immigration, exclusion of people of Asian descent, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Immigration Act of 1924. We know about Angel Island, which is where a lot of people of Asian descent came in terms of from immigration purposes that were subjugated to extraordinary types of evaluations. They were detained, many were deported under really horrific conditions. So we know that Asians have experienced an enormous amount of discrimination as it relates to immigration, becoming a citizen, being accepted as a US citizen, or being accepted as part of the US community. We know that Asians have also been racially otherized. We've had Supreme Court cases, such as the one with Ozawa and Thind, that have deemed Asians as racialized others, as not white, for a variety of reasons. And there have been some really material consequences that have come of that. We know that there have been anti-Asian sentiments that have fostered and festered for decades, that have pathologized Asian cultures, people of Asian descent. This is nothing new. Scholars have been writing about this for a very, very long time, but it's there, right? And I just want to acknowledge that. And we know that there's been anti-Asian sentiment that has really kind of peaked, especially during key moments, like during wartime, as we know, when thousands of people of Japanese descent were forcibly removed from their homes and put into camps. They were treated as prisoners in many ways in places, barracks surrounded by barbed wire. And I'm not sure if anyone has heard of James Fallon before, but he was running for a United States Senator for re-election, and his campaign slogan was "Keep America White," right? Like, yikes. That was like the campaign issue of the time, which reveals, you know, that anti-Asian sentiment, this is not something that's new. It's something that's been very much pervasive. And as we move forward into more recent decades, we know that people have been targeted of violent acts of hate. One which is very notable from 1982 with Vincent Chin, who was brutally assaulted and beaten for looking of Asian descent. He was confused to be a man of Japanese descent, even though he wasn't, and he was beaten to death by auto workers who were disenfranchised. And I don't believe they ever got any prison sentence after all was said and done. We know that Asian people have also not been counted. And this isn't just people of Asian descent, but as a fun fact, like one of those, the more you know, it wasn't until the US Census, 2000, so about 20 years ago, 2000, the US Census then that was the first decade census that actually asked people or allowed people to self-identify with more than one race. And so we know that many people of Asian descent, there's a growing number of people who self-identify as multiracial. And unfortunately, prior to the year 2000, they might not have been necessarily counted. And that has a lot of implications. We know that people of Asian descent have sometimes been called the model minority, which at first blush seems really complementary, but in reality is A, not true, and B, quite divisive, and has been used politically to wedge Asians from other communities of color. We could talk about that later, but I'm going to just kind of acknowledge. So we've seen this happen, in terms of interpersonal, we've seen this happen structurally. We also see this in the media with whitewashing, where we've got actors who are playing grotesque caricatures of people of Asian descent. We also have people who are sometimes cast improperly in terms of, so for example, for The Last Airbender, we had a situation where there are a bunch of white actors who were cast in protagonist roles. And then the one person of a main character who was of Asian descent was cast as the enemy role. And so you kind of start to see these different patterns in the media that are very troubling. And as we move into Halloween, as we move into the realm of social media, we can see cyberbullying, we can see racially charged messages, racist messages, and we can also see cultural appropriation that's happening. So, I mean, there's just so much that's happened, right? And I just want to make us aware, to remind us to think about what's happening today is connected to biases, to discrimination, to prejudice of yesteryear, of decades ago, of even hundreds of years ago, right? That this is something that is longstanding. And so that brings us to 2020, right? What's happening? And I just want to acknowledge, in terms of things that are going on where COVID-19 is being rebranded and the rhetoric around it is being called, quote unquote, the China virus, right? Or we have people in positions of power who are saying, referring to as Kung flu, really problematic, right? Even though the World Health Organization in 2015 had mentioned that, like, we don't want to do that. We are not going to call it anything related to cultures or organizations or people. We're calling it COVID-19, right? We're going to name things more scientifically. We've got reports of anti-hate on the rise. We're seeing an escalation both in hate crimes, hate incidents, people being targeted. We are also seeing people who are being assaulted in their everyday lives and in their communities. So we know that this is all happening. I'm sorry, this is like a lot for a Thursday evening, but to kind of highlight all of these things that are happening here. And I also just want to finally acknowledge on a more structural, governmental, and legislative perspective that there's a lot happening right now that might be affecting people who are here today. We have some restrictions and bans on visas, many of which might impact our international students, might impact our professional working folks who are part of our communities, people who are not documented. We've got things that are happening in terms of immigration suspension orders. And more recently, just a couple weeks ago, on September 22nd, there was an executive order that was, quote, on combating race and sex stereotyping, that's trying to put into challenge certain types of trainings and other types of programming that focuses on issues of racial and sex-based discrimination. So there's a lot happening right now. And so the idea is that this in itself can be absolutely overwhelming. If you feel overwhelmed, I get it. But I just want us to acknowledge what is happening and to also remember that this is not something new. This is something that's evolving, but it's connected to longer histories, longer tensions, and longer issues. And furthermore, it's part of a bigger issue. So we can certainly, today focus a lot on aspects of anti-Asian sentiment, anti-Asian racism, but I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge efforts toward social justice, efforts toward more racial justice, efforts toward intersecting identities and trying to make change. And so as we think about George Floyd, we think about Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, we think about so many people whose lives have been lost, who have been killed, and the efforts that we as, those who are part of a community of care can try to make a difference. And so when we think about discrimination, when we think about stigma, when we think about prejudice, this stuff matters. Our lives depend on it, our communities depend on it, and there's so many things that we need to do. So I want to ask you, after all of that information, I want to invite you to use the chat. I want to ask you to just put a yes if any of these statements apply to you. So I'm going to read, I think, 4 or 5 statements, and if any of these resonate with you, I just want you to type a yes. And if that's like too much, just give me a Y, like a Y, just like the letter Y in the chat, okay? Have you yourself ever felt like you didn't belong? Has there ever been a moment? Awesome, thank you. Oh, wow. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of Y's plugging through. So please know that you're not alone. Number 2, have you ever felt targeted because of your identity? It could be one, it could be multiple identities, it could be intersecting identities, but have you ever felt targeted because of who you are, not necessarily because of what you did or didn't do? Yeah, powerful. Thank you so much for sharing. A third one, have you ever witnessed someone being harassed or targeted? I'm not going to ask you to elaborate, but have you ever witnessed that? I think, you know, on the one hand, we've been targeted, we've experienced that, but there's things happening all around us. It might be on social media. Thank you. I'm seeing some exclamation points. Yes, this is happening. We're witnessing that, right? So these things are occurring. They're affecting you. They're things that you are observing and experiencing. Have you ever worried about a friend or a loved one? So sometimes it's not just about strangers. Sometimes there's people we really care about who are being impacted by discrimination, by many different things. And then the final thing, if you ever wanted to take action to stop hate, and you can put yes in the chat, but I'd love to, if you want to, go ahead and if you are able to, I know some folks are more technologically savvy than mine, and my my reactions just disappeared, I think, because I'm a co-host. But if you want to give a reaction, give me a thumbs up if you'd like, if you're interested in taking action to stop hate, if that's something that means something to you. And I love having the gallery view open because I can actually see you all doing that. And I see some people putting in the chat too. I know sometimes if you're joining us on your phone, sometimes that option isn't there in there. Thank you. It's awesome to see the thumbs up together. I am definitely with you. Good. Well, if any of those comments resonate with you, if you put the yes in there, then maybe what you're starting to think about is, what can I do, right? What can I do? And I think that's the question that's guiding today. But maybe if I can be so bold to just rephrase this slightly and to suggest, what can we do, right? That it's not just the I, but it's also the we. And so today, in terms of the big picture, kind of putting these puzzle pieces together, we're going to be talking about communicating change. So how we can use our voice, how we can use our bodies, how we can use our words and our nonverbals to change people's biases, to make people more aware, to change their actions, to stop discrimination. And I recognize there's no magic bullet. I wish I could solve this all for you within the next, 45 minutes. But in reality, what I want to do is to share some tools and some ways that you may want to think about it, both at an individual level and also in terms of thinking about it in terms of teaching and your community. So a couple of caveats. First of all, you are not alone. So please know, especially with the chat, we saw that folks care. This is affecting us. This is not something that you have to take on all by yourself, even though I think sometimes it helps identify some individual things that you can do. And so of course we want to be connected, and I'm hoping that this particular session might help you realize that there are a bunch of people who care about this, who are interested in these topics, and we want to work together to make change. And certainly that knowledge is power. So starting here, starting at Purdue, thinking about our education, how we can learn more, become more self-aware, expand our lexicon so that we're able to talk about these things in more nuanced ways. But part of this is just about breaking the silence and figuring out how best to intervene in any given moment. So I'd like to go ahead and try something. I do this in my classes, and this sometimes works really well. So we're gonna see. We're gonna take a moment, what I call lava button. So I'm gonna ask you to use the chat and to write your answer, but do not hit the enter button. So don't hit send. So what we're gonna do is I want you to pretend that the enter button or the send button is lava. So I want you to go ahead and just type your response. I do this so that people don't have their answers influenced by someone else who already posts. Sometimes you see something, you're like, let me copy and paste that. So I really want this to be your own fresh answer. If you could give in just one phrase or one sentence or less, the answer of, why do some people not intervene when they witness an act of discrimination? So why do people sometimes freeze? Why do some people run away? Why do people sometimes just not do anything? Why do they not intervene? Take about 10 or 15 seconds to type something in the chat. And there is no one right answer, so don't worry. And I'm not grading you, so don't worry. This is not going to go onto WebCT, discussion board, Canvas, or any of that kind of stuff. This is really asking you to reflect. Why do people fail to intervene? Okay, let's go ahead and de-lava that button. And if you want to go ahead and enter, and let's see what we've got. Yeah, and I want to invite you to scroll through the chat. I know a lot of things just populated into the chat, but it's really some really powerful answers here, and I'm gonna just hit some highlights. So yeah, Cindy mentioning, don't know what to do, afraid of the consequences. Oh, Kathleen, yeah, thinking someone else will do that, diffuse responsibility. Right, yeah, definitely. Chia mentioning fear for their own safety. Yeah, scared of getting hurt, trying to navigate the authority and the politics of the situation, fear/embarrassment. Some people feeling like it's not their own problem. Yeah, Blake, absolutely. And some people worried about making things worse. There's so many different reasons why we don't intervene. We know that as observers, as witnesses, that we don't want to just expect those who are being targeted or victimized to have to take the stand, right? It shouldn't be all on them, that we as a community need to work together to intervene. But a lot of times we freeze when the moment happens, when we're scrolling through our social media and we see something, or when we're walking down the street and we see something. A lot of times we freeze. And in my research, there's been 4 main things that have come into fruition. So number 1, and this might resonate with you, the perceived risks outweigh the benefits. You know, people are scared of embarrassing themselves, of failing, of causing further damage. And so people being more risk focused as opposed to thinking about the benefits and just the urgency of responding. One of the bigger ones, which I think some folks mentioned here, was what we call communication inefficacy. I think sometimes people feel like they just don't know what to say or what to do. And so when the moment happens, they kind of freeze and they don't know, the words aren't there. There's no script. It's as if those muscles haven't been flexed before. And so there's no kind of instant response. The third one, which is really interesting, this is research that I'm doing right now with my team, we're finding that there's limited definitions in intervention. Specifically that a lot of people in their day-to-day seem to think that bystander intervention is synonymous with this idea of confrontation. So many people, for whatever reason, seem to, in their mind, conceptualize or define anti-hate bystander intervention with confronting the offender. And in reality, they're not necessarily thinking about all of the other different communicative tips, techniques, strategies, and things that we could do, like offer support, distract, document. There's so many other things that we can do that could be forms of intervention. But when we think about it just so narrowly, sometimes we forget about all other ways that might also ameliorate the situation. We also have found through our research that there are some folks who think that they are doing amazing work. Like they put on a button saying that they're an ally. They think that they're doing really great work. We've like had them in the lab and recorded video nonverbals and things like that. And they're like, yeah, I intervened. And then when we look at the footage, all they did was kind of give someone a side eye. And so sometimes there is a little bit of a mismatch in what people think they're doing versus what they actually are doing. So sometimes they think they're the lion, but they're actually the lamb. It gets a little bit confusing. And of course, cultural and structural factors that may be impeding people. I know sometimes we live in cultures of fear. Sometimes we live in organizational cultures where the norm and the expectation is not to do anything. And that can breed a really toxic climate. So I'm going to ask you, I'm going to give you about 30 seconds or so. And I just want to give you a scenario. I want you to imagine, and the question is, what would you do? So I want you to imagine this is based on a true situation, and I'm going to soften the language slightly just for the purposes of this example, but this is based on a true situation that happened on April 19th, 2020. So I want you to imagine that you're walking across campus. So you're walking across campus by yourself and you see a person down the sidewalk who presents as an Asian or Asian American woman. And she's walking by herself, presumably to class. She's heading across campus. And some random man approaches her and suddenly yells, "Go back to whatever country you came from. We don't need you or your virus." And then the man begins to walk away. So this is based off of a true story, not at Purdue, but in the United States. I want you to take 30 seconds and kind of think about what you would do or what you would say. And once you've had a moment to kind of think about that, I would love for you to feel free to put it in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and talk it out for a moment or two with the rest of us. What would you do? What would you say? And there's not one right way to respond. It's complicated. It's organic. There's a lot of different factors, not just of what you're witnessing, but also the complexities of your own positionality, right? Who you are in this scenario. Good. So Haisung Moon is saying, not sure I would say anything to the aggressor, but I would check in with the victim. Yeah, to see if they're okay and provide support. I love that. Yep. And then Nikolai is talking about go comfort the woman and let her know that she is welcome. Yeah. So I'm seeing efforts of providing support. This is great. Anything else? Do I have anyone here who actually would confront? Maybe in your mind after, I don't know. I know some people ruminate and they think, oh, this is what I wished I would have done. Sometimes confrontation isn't the best, right? Because we don't know about the safety of the situation, but sometimes there are moments where it's needed, right? So I'm going to just share some things, and I'm going to link it to pedagogy in just a moment. So bystander intervention, there's many different techniques that we can do, different things that we could do. So we can talk about directly addressing the offender or the aggressor, which, I think for right now, many of us are saying we're not sure if we would do that. We could distract, we could delegate or get help. If we want additional people, if we feel like ourselves alone might not necessarily be enough in this situation, we can provide support, which a lot of people mentioned. We can document the situation. I know a lot of people have smartphones, and sometimes what's needed is to actually remember and capture that moment, especially moments of hate incidences or hate crimes. We can delay and circle back. We can file a report. We could donate to certain causes. I think the donate might not necessarily make as much sense in this point, but what I'm trying to say is, as we think about the lions and the lands and expanding, there's a lot of different things that we can do. So as you're thinking about this, what I would encourage you to consider is, what is your primary goal? So what do you want? Is your goal to make sure that the woman is okay? Is your goal to stop this person, the aggressor, from acting like that in the future, so they know that they shouldn't just be doing this, right? So that it doesn't happen again. Is your goal to make folks on campus aware of this situation? And then once you've kind of started to think through that, consider whether you want to call that person out. So you want to tell that person off, let them know what you think, to call them in, to ask them, what did you mean by that? To ask them to clarify, to educate them. Some people, it may not be worth your time, but other people it might be. And so that's something to think about. But of course, considering your safety first. I want to give you one other example, and I'm going to ask you, if we had more time, I would put you in breakout rooms or something like that, but I want you to read this one. I think a lot of times we're seeing this on social media. And so I want to encourage you to kind of think about, imagine that you have a friend and you're reading through a thread on Twitter, or if you've got another social media platform of choice, and you notice that there are a couple people who are starting to pile on and to say some really awful things to her via Twitter. And these are kind of random individuals. Go ahead and take about 15, 20 seconds and pop in the chat if you feel free, if you feel comfortable. What would you do? And if you would do nothing, that's okay too. You can put that in the chat as well. And if anyone wants to share what they'd like to say, you can use you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you'd like to as well. Go ahead. And I think social media is such a unique frontier, right? It's such a unique space, sometimes of toxicity, right? That, yeah, there's definitely some potential risks that we have to think about from an individual perspective, or if you are representing an organization, there can also be some risks too. So whether you are an individual or an organization spokesperson, that this can be tricky. So for some people, it's about documenting. For some people, it's about reporting it. For some people, it's about not engaging, but rather connecting with your friend, right? And making sure that your friend is okay. So that's something that one can do. So I guess part of this is recognizing there's a lot of different things to consider. But yeah, I think what you're bringing up is definitely something to consider. I love it. There's some folks who are sharing in there. Yeah, so some great examples to the chat. Thank you all so much for connecting and for sharing your thoughts, and I'll leave that there for folks to read. So yeah, so part of this is kind of figuring out what can we do individually. Certainly there are a lot of different things that we can do though, and bring it into our educational spaces, into our classrooms and beyond. I want to just share some projects and some things that we've been doing, some activities, some things that you might want to consider doing in your own classes. I will note there are some things I was trying to figure out how much into the weeds should I get, and we can maybe talk about this in the Q&A. For those who, do I have any teachers, professors, instructors, or those who aspire to be teachers? I know there may be some undergrads who are going into teaching in their careers. Can you give me an emoji, like a smile emoji? Can I get my teachers to smile at me? Or to give a thumbs up or something? Do I have any folks who are in teaching? Yay. Excellent. So I think part of this, before I jump into it, some things to think about might be to consider our actual curricula, right? What are our objectives? Whose readings are we including? Who are we marginalizing? Whose voices are at the table? And how can we bring more participation through it? So, I mean, I think there are some things at a very fundamental level that we should certainly be thinking about. And I would love to talk about that more in the Q&A if we have time, but I want to make sure, that's fine. I want to make sure that we have time to kind of talk about some projects in an effort to encourage you to think about some ways that you might be able to adapt things. I'm going to share an activity called Unmasking Privilege, which has been adapted from Dr. Brenda Allen's work. I'm going to share some information about a bystander intervention workshop. We're going to talk about a couple of social media campaigns that I've been doing with my students, and then also a briefing about Share Your Story. And before I get into this, I do want to just mention, I'm working right now at a predominantly white institution in the Midwest that's a public institution. I love it. It's a wonderful place, but there are some unique complexities that are happening there. One of which was I did a survey with my undergraduate students. We surveyed community members and folks who are also at the university, and we noticed several things that were coming into light with our results. One of which was that the vast majority of people did not think that discrimination happened locally. So they recognized that this was an issue nationally. They recognized that there was tension, there were biases, there was discrimination, but they wanted to, in general, there's a tendency to want to deny that it was happening locally and that it was affecting people in our community. And that was a really big aha moment for us. And that'll link that back to where we're going with some of this stuff. So the first thing is an activity that I've adapted from Dr. Brenda Allen, who's an amazing professor. And this is something that can be really, really quick. If you're thinking about trying to build allyship, allies are people who are using their social privilege to dismantle structural oppression, to speak out against discrimination, to reduce others' biases and their own. One thing that we need to do is we need to start recognizing what our privilege is. And I know there's a lot of different activities and things out there. One of the interesting things in the realm of social distancing is that we can't necessarily do some of the ones that we typically do. One of the ones that I think has been particularly helpful is Dr. Allen's work, and I can share a link with information about her published research. But what she does is she tries to encourage us to think about ourselves as multidimensional, thinking about how our identities are intersecting and how we may have different forms of privilege in certain areas, but not necessarily privilege in other areas. And I think whether we're in the classroom or we're running a workshop, something that we want to do is we want to encourage people to think more critically about what privilege is. And I run different workshops on this. And one thing that always strikes me is that I inevitably will have some folks who will be in the space with us and they'll think that privilege means that you've won the lottery, that privilege means that you're in the 1%. And in reality, what privilege really is regarding when we're thinking about social privilege are these unearned benefits and advantages that we have based on our own identities. And so what Brenda Allen did was she encouraged people to look at how privilege manifests in our everyday lives. That is not whether you won the lottery or not, but how it can load onto different aspects of our identity. And so what she would encourage people to do is she'd have a big bowl of beads and she would read off different statements. She would have different lists of statements that people could bring up to them. And based on any statement that resonated with them, they would grab a bead, essentially. And at the end, people would have just a string of beads that kind of symbolically resembled and reminded them of the different forms of privilege that they have. And the idea is that it's not we're trying to get the most privilege or the least amount of privilege, but recognizing that everyone has some privilege of which they can use to potentially make a difference in their everyday lives, to make a difference for equity, for diversity and inclusion. So here's a couple of just statements that I wanted to share from her exercise, and I'll talk a little bit about how we've been adapting it this year. So in terms of things for like sexuality, a statement that she had created was, people don't ask why I choose my sexual orientation. So if people have privilege as it relates to their sexuality, they're not asked why they choose their sexual orientation, or that people might be able to move about in public without fear of being harassed because of their sexuality. Statements about ability privilege might be something along the lines of, quote, I have never been taunted or socially ostracized due to a disability. Another statement might be, in terms of having privilege as it relates to ability, might be, if I'm fired or not hired, I don't ask questions whether it had to do with anything of my abilities. Gender, a statement, person with gender privilege might say, my elected representatives are mostly people who match my gender. They might say, if I have children and a successful career, few people ask me how I do it all, how I balance my professional and personal lives. And things about race, like she'll, a statement that will be asked in terms of thinking about racial privilege. To what extent have you never been asked to speak for all people of a racial group? And I know I've been asked on more than one occasion to speak on behalf of all Asian people, which is like terrifying. How many people, I'm like, I can't do that, right? That's not good. And one more statement, schools in the community teach about my race and heritage and present it in a positive manner throughout the school year, right? So all of these things, ways that people are experiencing privilege and having discussions about it. More recently, I've been adjusting this and connecting it to the pandemic. So kind of talking about how people may be afforded different privilege as it relates to class, even something as simple as internet bandwidth, right? I'm able to attend my Zoom class meetings. I have enough internet to connect, or I have a device. I'm able to take classes and not have to write my papers on my smartphone because that's the only device that I have. All of these taken for granted things and how the pandemic is rendering things more inequitable, bringing those into the classroom and bringing that to light, right? What can we do as professors, as instructors to render our spaces, our classes, and our communities more equitable? So thinking about that and expanding the identities. I've done some bystander intervention workshops, and I would love to get into that more later, but kind of some things in terms of some of the stuff that we're doing in classes, helping them think about different ways to respond so that they're not just necessarily workshops and classes that students are electing to take, but rather it's built in and baked into the curriculum. So we're thinking about that. And I do this in my classes on persuasion. I'm also teaching a class on interpersonal communication, and we're going to be doing that later on this semester. Another type of pedagogy that has been happening, or another type of teaching way that we've been doing, is thinking about how our students, and coming from the communication discipline, how we can use social media potentially for good. And I recognize that this can be a tricky situation, but we've actually had some success with this. And I was actually inspired by several universities of years past. So Miami University, the real Oxford Asians, and as well as I Am to Harvard, I Am to Yale, there's many different social media campaigns that have happened where people who are marginalized, people of color, people who have been targeted because of their identities have actually taken a stand and created messages that really confront the ways in which they're stereotyped. And so this was a really powerful thing, and it drew from some of the data that our students had taken, where people were saying in our community, people aren't stereotyped. In our community, people don't experience discrimination. And we thought, how can we make this salient to folks? How can we make people realize that this is actually happening here locally? And so what we did was we started a social media campaign on shattering stereotypes more locally, and we had students go out into the community. We had students go out into our student union, and we had people create messages and take selfies. This was a few years ago, so this is when selfies were all the rage. And we asked people to identify a stereotype that affected them. So call it out, right? We need to render that salient, and then to explain how they actually were challenging or debunking it. And so in doing so, we have a message of empowerment, people kind of reframing and challenging the stereotype that's been put on them. But at the same time, we also have moments where people are recognizing their classmates, people are recognizing their neighbors or their community members and saying, oh my goodness, this affects them and I care about them, which was kind of powerful for them to think about it more locally. So asking people to kind of figure that out. And for the folks who participated, gave them a chance to kind of think about how they might actually refute or rebut certain stereotypes that had been imposed on them and change that narrative. We also did some Stop Hate campaigns. We partnered with a local organization called Not in Our Town, and we had our students for the semester participate in at the farmers market. Yeah, absolutely. And we also had campus fair activity booths where people were taking pledges as it related to speaking out against discrimination. We had programming and paneling. Our students helped to promote certain events that were happening. And so in this persuasion class that I was teaching at the undergraduate level, we had a semester long where we partnered with Not in Our Town to encourage people to recognize that, hey, this is an issue and that we're going to come together and make a difference. So both through programming, through pledges, and also through some community events and panels. It was a pretty exciting thing, but getting students involved. And I think something that I got from my students that they reflected upon at the end of the semester was they loved that they had an impact. So it wasn't just about taking an exam, writing a paper that I graded, sent back to them, and then they like threw in the recycling bin. But seeing how things were making a difference, seeing how they could use persuasion to influence people to take a stand and to advocate with them, it was really powerful. And then the final one, in terms of kind of thinking more in the classroom, was a share your story. And this was something that was linking back to that notion of that survey again, where people are saying that discrimination doesn't happen here, it doesn't affect people. That everyone's just nice in our town, which I would like to think, but at the same time, our data suggested that there were people, especially people who are from marginalized communities, who did not have the same experience, right? And so what we did was, in one of our classes, we had a semester where we gathered stories. We asked people in the community to share their own stories of what it was to be like in our town. You know, to share what their experiences were, what their hopes were. We also had each of our students, for perspective taking and empathy, to create their own message, and to have that recorded and shared, which was a really powerful way to kind of go to. I think stories are really, really important. You can share a lot of stats, but all of a sudden with the stories, you've got human beings, you've got a connectivity, and sometimes, especially when you know people, it can make a really big difference. It's not just some person, but it's your person, right? It's your friend, it's your neighbor, it's your classmates. So the final thing I'm going to talk about, and I'm almost done, thank you all so much, this has been a lot of content, is kind of moving from the what can I do into the what can we do. And I just wanted to share two quick projects that we've been working on, one of which is a 3-year-long NSF Adaptation Advanced Grant, and I'm happy to talk about this more in detail too, but this is focusing more on our academic community. So at BGSU, we are trying to work on making our university community a more equitable place. We're trying to work on supporting our minoritized faculty in STEM, social behavioral sciences, and beyond. And so we have been doing bystander intervention training. We have worked on training our deans, our chairs, and our provosts on aspects of discrimination, reducing biases. We've been making recommendations on policy change. It's been incredible. More recently, we've been starting to design online modules so that we can take the stuff that we've created and share them beyond just BGSU. And so I'm happy to talk about that in greater length as well, but that's something that we've been working on. And then one other topic that I just thought might be really powerful as we think about Purdue, and I imagine there are folks who are doing this, and maybe ARC is doing this as well, or will be doing this post-pandemic, but is channeling the notion of dialogue, getting people from different perspectives, different experiences, and different positionalities together. We found that having dinner, food, was what really brought people together. And one of the issues that we had surveyed in our community that was really a big problem in 2019 was the opioid crisis. And it still actually is a problem. It's actually getting worse because of the pandemic. But what we ended up doing was we got some grant funding, and we decided to bring people together to try to destigmatize the notion of the opioid crisis. We tried to get people together to talk about what we can do, what kind of programming, what kind of resources and further support we can make. And so what we had was we had a team of people. We trained a bunch of facilitators to sit at tables. We brought people in, we fed them, and we had them talk in guided discussions about education issues. What do we need to know about the opioid crisis? What are some misconceptions? We had some health professionals who came in to help facilitate and clarify myths about the opioid crisis and addiction. We had some folks who came in and facilitated conversations about stopping the stigma, as well as we had local leaders and even a state senator who stopped by to help to facilitate the conversation. And an amazing thing about all of this was at the end of the event, we surveyed them, and they talked about how it actually did reduce their stigma. It helped them connect with people with whom they didn't think that they had a lot in common. And it also, people were much more motivated to want to do something about this now that the stigma was reduced, now that they wanted to, now that they felt more connected to people who cared about the issue as well. And I had an amazing mom who came up to me afterwards, and she had lost a young adult child to the opioid crisis, and she came to me in tears, and she said that she just thought that she was alone. She thought that she was the only one who was affected by this issue. And she said to see a gym packed with people who were all willing to talk about it, to break the silence on it, to reduce stigma about this really highly charged issue, she felt so encouraged and she felt more connected than ever before. So, you know, I want to encourage you, whether it's dialogue, whether it's training, whether it's activities, whether it's reflection or social media campaigns, there's so many different things that we can do in terms of making a difference both locally, more regionally and beyond, especially as we start to think about different technologies. And of course, there are challenges, there are risks, and we can definitely talk about that too. But I am at my time, so I'm going to pause and just say thank you all so much for going on this journey with me. There's a lot of information, and I know through Zoom, it's a different kind of modality, but let me just say thank you all so much. And what questions do you have?
If you don't have any more questions, I would like to really thank Dr. Lisa Hanasono for being here with us. Thank you so much. And again, in the future, as soon as all this is over, we would love to meet in person and welcome you back to Purdue. Thank you, everyone who is here with us. And Manabu, do you want to talk a little bit about our evaluation today?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Sari and Dr. Hanasono for a wonderful presentation today. I would like to encourage you all who have participated in our event to please take a moment to click on the link in the chat and take a brief survey about this event. So that really helps us to continue creating these opportunities for everyone to enjoy and learn from. So we would greatly appreciate your cooperation in helping us with that evaluation. So it's not really hard at all. So it's very easy to do. So I would encourage you to do so. And it would also be included in it was also included in the email that you received when you registered for this event as well. So thank you.
So yeah, so if you can take a couple minutes to do so.
That sounds great. And everyone, thank you so much again for choosing to be here. Thank you for going on this journey. And also a huge thanks to Pam and Abu, the AARCC team in Purdue, for making this possible. My email address is lisakh@bgsu.edu, and I'll include this in the chat. So if there's something that comes up after today's session, feel free to contact me anytime. I'm happy to both connect with you via email, or if you wanted to set up a one-on-one Zoom session to continue the conversation, especially if you yourself connected to any of these ideas and want to figure out how to adapt it, or if you want my actual assignment materials and things along those lines, I'm happy to share as much as possible. So I'll go ahead and share my information in the link, and thank you again so much.
Thank you again, everyone, for coming tonight and be with us. If you go to the AARCC website, we have a list of, and you go to events and fall 2020 events, we have the whole list of events that we do all semester. So I would like to encourage you to also attend our other events. But thank you so much for joining us. And Dr. Hanasono, if you have a couple moments, just minutes to stay with us after. So yes, if you would like to chat more, introduce yourself to Dr. Hanasono after the formal event is done, feel free to stay and speak a little bit. Thank you so much. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.